Hello everyone, and welcome to this short instructional video for the upcoming assignment, Follow That Food. Okay, so the initial post, this again is one of these discussion posts. This is going to be a longer discussion post. The initial post is going to be due on May 1st, and then you have about 2 days to respond to a classmate's post. This is worth 10 points, a minimum of 500 words, not including a works cited at the bottom. You must respond to a classmate's post about 200 words minimum, turn it in on Canvas's discussion board. So just copy and paste directly in there. You're going to be exploring the gender relationships between food production, the environment, and food preparation using the film Dolores, which is available up on Canvas, and 2 required course readings, and they can be from course readings from any of the modules. And what you're going to be doing is you're going to be selecting one food item of your choice. And these can range from grapes, pork, coffee, salmon, rice, corn syrup, etc. And you're going to investigate through online resources the impact of this food item on women. The reason why we're doing this is to connect what we see in Dolores, where she is somebody who's not only worked around labor inequalities, but particularly how these labor inequalities have affected women, but also not only labor inequalities, but looking at the labor inequalities, particularly within farm workers in the Central Valley. She's also addressing issues around the environmental issues that are still very much plaguing communities who are working here in the agribusiness here in the Central Valley. She's also looking a lot in this film through her work and activism around gender inequalities throughout it. So not only through labor, but also through the movement itself, as well as through the environmental impact. So using Dolores, what we're going to do is to do essentially a thought experiment of looking at one item of food, something that we don't even think about, like pork, like corn, and etc., and talk about how there is a very much a gendered relationship to this food, both in regards to the production and producing of this food, to the distribution of this food, to then just the making this food in our home. And this very much relates to the article that's assigned for this week, which is called Women in the Food Chain. And in this chapter, they talk a lot about the social relations of food and how it's always been organized around very clear gendered lines. Today, as they say in the chapter, today in most societies, women continue to carry the responsibility for the mental and manual labor of food provision, the most basic labor of care. And it's true that when you look at this, you see a lot of things, that women perform the majority of food labor work. One is that women actually make up a large percentage of the farm working force. Unfortunately, though, they are the least represented in regards to labor unions, workers' rights, and so forth. Oftentimes, it is women who do the much more menial, low-pay tasks in farm production. A lot of times, then they're forced into temporary positions, which means that they don't get workers' comp or any sort of benefits or any sort of health care precautions. Women are also very much present in food packing houses, as well as in production lines, as well as in processing food. Women make up a big bulk of the manufacturing era, but they make up the big bulk particularly in the lower paying sector of the industry. And then a big thing for this week, is particularly the chapter on women and environment, is that environmental devastation affects us all, but it particularly affects women because women are the ones who are the most present with environmental dangers. Like they're the ones who are cooking and cleaning with the filthy water, right? They are the ones who are ingesting polluted food that then affects their bodies and then their children. They are the ones that oftentimes, because of poverty, because of wage inequality, are forced to live in areas with high pollution and so forth. So environmental degradation, environmental pollution, the environmental crisis that we are in affects us all regardless of our gender, but women do bear the brunt of it. And a lot of that is around, again, something that we talked about the week prior around women in work, in that women make up the bulk of poverty. And a lot of that is because of low wages, denial of workforce or being able to work, as well as just the cost of childcare. That's where the mommy tax comes in regards to women bear still the brunt of the cost, and both costs in regards to economic costs as well as labor in regards to childcare. And then something that definitely last week, but this week we're going to talk even some more, is that women still cook most of the food, while chefs, which is a profession, is often dominated by men. Cooking, whether in restaurants or at home, are still dominated by women, and women do up the bulk of the cooking and the food preparation in households. So what you're going to do is you're going to take a raw ingredient, meaning that I don't want you to look at Cheetos or something that's already been processed, but instead looking at the raw component. So, like, let's say if you were interested in bread, you would look at wheat. Well, for this, I wanted to give you sort of an experiment of how you would do this, and something that I take for granted and don't realize how much I'm consuming is palm oil. Now, some of you might actually cook with palm oil in your homes. For me, I never actually experienced cooking with palm oil in preparation of food, but I certainly have eaten a lot of palm oil because palm oil and palm-based ingredients are found in approximately 50% of supermarket products. Palm oil is much sought after because it's cheap and versatile. Oils from palm fruit are processed into edible oils used for cooking, such as processing foods such as chocolate, biscuits, cereal. It can also be made into ingredients such as glycerin, used in laundry detergent, cosmetics like toothpaste, soap, shower cream, and shampoo. If you have done any of these things, if you've eaten any of these things, used any of these products, and there's far more than this, you have consumed palm oil. Now, I want to so taking palm oil, let's just talk about the gendered relationship with palm oil. So, let's first talk about the production. Indonesia and Malaysia are the largest producers of palm oil in the world. They produce about 35 tons a year. Indonesia accounts for about 45% of the world's palm oil supply. And around 3 million Indonesians work in this sector, accounting for at least a third of the global palm oil workforce. And while Indonesia generally, as a country, generally has strong labor laws, they have incredible weak enforcement of these laws and has led to companies being able to get away with systemic abuses of workers in palm oil plantations. Another factor is environmental degradation. Indonesia and Malaysia have some of the most diverse rainforests in the world, and a lot of it is being cut down to create palm oil production plants. So most of these rainforests are being cut down where a lot of indigenous native communities live who depend upon farming and living within the rainforest, and therefore they've been kicked off their lands as well as being forced into labor to work at these plantations because there's no other way of survival. These plantations often push indigenous peoples from their land of their own, leaving entire communities with no choice but to work there. Deforestation on such a massive scale has not only threatened the well being and culture of indigenous peoples within these rainforests, but has also become a global significance, contributing to carbon emissions and heightened concerns around climate change. And for the most part, Indonesia and Malaysia have turned a blind eye to this. For example, between 2001 and 2017, Indonesia lost 24 million hectares of forest cover, basically the size of the United Kingdom. Now, with that, then, the environmental destruction, there's also incredible amounts of human rights abuse. So, again, these palm oil plantations are owned by companies. And for example, Wilmar, which is a company that produces palm oil, they produce about 43% of the global palm oil trade. Their revenue is in the billions. Like last year, they made over $40 billion. But the workers in these plantations, many of these are indigenous peoples who've been forced off their lands to work there, struggle to earn enough for their families to live on, in extreme cases earning as little as $2 a day. And here's the thing is that workers then struggle to survive and sustain their families as plantation owners pay them little to no wages. And then palm oil producers often utilize financial punishments when employees make mistakes or fail to make work requirements. There's also this incredible push around human trafficking, particularly for women and children to work in these plantations. And because of the loose labor laws, women and children are bearing the brunt of it. The expansion of the palm oil plantations in Malaysia and Indonesia has turned many women who were particularly indigenous women in the area who provided food for their family, into landless food buyers and cheap labor with no adequate safety and health protection. Um, you know, in Indonesia, where close to 6 million people work in the palm oil industry, women have to toil alongside men in remote plantations across the country. But women are not often paid as much as men, nor are they considered actual workers. They're a lot of times considered temporary workers, meaning that they are forced to work in very informal situations where they're not being paid a living wage, and oftentimes are doing very backbreaking menial work in regards to just picking up kernels or spraying chemicals. A lot of women are forced to also go into the industry to support their husbands who are, since it's very difficult for their husbands to achieve the very high harvest targets imposed on them. So plantation owners are putting on these really high labor goals where it's like, it's basically impossible to harvest as much palm kernels as they force them to do. And if you don't reach your daily target, you don't get paid. So you have then women also working alongside their husbands doing that, but not getting paid, but only there to really to sort of make sure their husbands reach that target, because it's impossible for one person to do it alone. These women work without adequate safety and health equipment. There's also women have also been given much more dangerous duties than men because they are employed to do work that technically is illegal, such as spraying with chemicals, such as fertilizers, and spraying pesticides. Companies oftentimes do not provide these women with tools or safety trainings, and women carry out these activities without access to regular medical checkups. Companies don't provide full information the potential impacts and dangers of these chemicals used, nor do they provide training on how to reduce the risk of exposure. As a result, many of the women who are working here, and again, they're working without adequate pay, working very menial tasks, and a lot of times having to be exposed to very harsh chemicals, they frequently experience occupational diseases such as respiratory problems, burning of their hands, dizziness, blurred eyes, and even blindness. Women workers in palm oil plantations are some of the most vulnerable and at risk workforce, yet they are the least represented. So, that is the environmental impact of, if we talk about environmental and labor impact in regards to the growing and harvesting of palm oil. And when we look at sort of the processing of palm oil for products, we see that large companies like Nestle, as well as Hershey's, as well as the Heinz Company, some of the largest food makers and some of the most recognizable house brands, they're buying oil that is literally exploiting women's labor. They're also then having issues in regards within their own factories where women workers are not being paid as much as their male workers in factories. And there's also been recent discoveries around human trafficking and labor laws there. So there's incredible exploitation just within the factories that produce these things like Cheez-Its, like Oreos, and so forth that we all enjoy, and we forget how much there's a gendered cost to it. But even if we wanted to then just move beyond just the production of palm oil, so from the growing of palm oil to creating it into a piece of food that we eat, like Cheez-Its or cereal or whatever, we can then move palm oil to the United States in regards to food shortage. Globally, women are more likely to live in extreme poverty than men, and a lot of that is because of wage inequality. Of the 821 million people who are food insecure in the world right now, 60% are women and girls. When we look here in the United States, over 14 million women were or are food insecure. And a lot of that is because of women's roles in managing family feeding make them vulnerable to the consequences of food insecurity. These include inadequate intakes of fruits and vegetables, plus associated nutrients and risk of obesity. The U.S. Department of Agriculture reveals that household food insecurity rates for households with children headed by a single mother is over 30%, and women living alone over 14%, which is pretty particularly high. And for those of you who have visited a food bank or depend upon a food bank, you know very much that a large bulk of these foods are processed foods, canned foods, box foods, what we would call shelf-stable foods. And a lot of them have palm oil in them. So here you have what I see as a connection between the palm oil that's being produced in the field that's not only environmentally hurting women, but labor-wise hurting women, the factories that create this, that creates job inequality, the way that this food is oftentimes distributed in low-income, food insecurity ways because, again, and the fact that particularly women are the ones who are needing these food banks and so forth because they are highly represented in poverty and food insecurity. And then when you go into the home, women are the ones who are still responsible for household food intake and to create meals for the family. I see a connection between palm oil in regards to all sort of stages, from the environment to the labor that produces it to literally in our home. And all of it has a gendered relationship that particularly negatively affects women. So, what you saw from my example was that we can look at something like palm oil and we can see a lot of gendered relationship, from the environmental destruction that happens in palm oil production that particularly affects indigenous communities, but especially indigenous women who need those lands to survive and support their families. Therefore, they have no other choice but to work in these palm oil plantations where they're not paid as much. They're oftentimes being forced into some really dangerous labor practices. So, there we have then another sort of gendered relationship around this food in regards to the incredible amounts of labor violations, particularly as it affects female workers in the palm oil industry, from all the way from the plantations to the factories. And then, what I did was sort of talk about how palm oil, since it's used in a majority of packaged goods or what we would call shelf stable products, is often, one, if it's oftentimes inaccessible due to cost, and if it is accessible, a lot of times women are not able to access that because of huge amounts of food insecurity and poverty for women here in this country. So made that connection there. And then, talking about like who prepares the food. Most of the time it falls upon women. So there you have it. So with palm oil, I can talk about it in multiple directions about the gendered relationship to this food. And that is the type of thing I want you to do is I want you to sort of research an item and then explore the gendered relationships around food and this item all from the environment to the labor to how it's produced at home, how it's prepared, to family domestic relationships, and so forth. Okay, so again, just to remind you, this is a larger discussion post, so the minimum is 500 words, not including a works cited at the bottom. You must respond to a classmate's post, 200 words minimum. You're just going to copy and paste this directly into Canvas. You don't need to upload a PDF or a doc. You also need to incorporate arguments and points made from Dolores, so make sure that you are, when you're watching the film, that you are also taking notes. And then you must incorporate 2 course readings in your entire post, and that can be from this week, last week, and so forth. So, as I said before, I don't want you to take an already processed food and follow it from there. Meaning, like, I don't want you to take like a Hershey chocolate bar and then go from there. Instead, I want you to talk about cocoa, which is a necessary ingredient for chocolate, right? So you would then go into cocoa plantations, which has a lot of human rights abuses there. So, spoiler there. And then talking about cocoa all the way through, you can eventually go to chocolate bars and you can eventually go talk about chocolate. But I want you first to start off with a raw ingredient. So, for example, you can talk about grapes, like if you're interested in talking about wine. You can talk about chicken from the start to then where you get to, KFC, right? For example. Or canola, if you're interested in oils, you can talk about canola and therefore then get you to canola oil, which is how, I started with palm trees and then palm oil. Again, so start with the raw ingredients and then work your way through. And then once you have that and you start looking into it and just start Googling and sort of searching things, I need you to then answer these questions in your post. First, you're going to be looking at 3 areas. For the first one is labor and food production. So you're going to be focusing on women's labor in producing of this food. You're then going to also look at the environmental impact, focusing on the environmental impact of this food and its effect on women. And then the third one is food access and preparation. You're going to focus on food preparation and its effect on women. So for the first one, I want you to answer these questions. What are the human rights issues affecting women working and producing this food? What are the labor challenges, equal pay, maternity leave, childcare, etc., facing women who work in this industry? For the second one, or part B, environmental impact, I want you to answer these 2 questions. What is the environmental impact or cost of producing this food? And 2, how or in what way does this impact women's lives? And then C, food access and preparation, I want you to answer these 2 questions. 1, who is typically in charge of preparing or using this food item to create a meal for the household? And 2, how does the gender division of domestic labor, work inside the home, affect women? So I need you to answer all these questions in an essay post. Again, similar to all the other discussion posts that we've had, such as the Adichie one, as well as the film analysis one. I want you to not answer them like question 1, question 2, but instead in an essay. You can divide it up into part A, part B, part C, but I do want a coherent essay in this. And then always remember again that you're going to need to include 2 course readings as well as discussions from the Dolores film in your response. So just to recap, your initial post is going to be due May 1st, and then you have until May 3rd to respond to a classmate's post. You got to include arguments and points from Dolores, and you must incorporate 2 course readings in your entire post. Again, if you have any questions, anything going on, feel free to shoot me out an email. Happy to answer any questions you have. Okay, looking forward to seeing what you find out.